The dark alley was quiet except for the low rumble of engines and the soft echo of boots on concrete. The only light came from the flickering lamps lining the alley, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch for miles. A group of bikers stood in a tight formation, their leather jackets gleaming under the dim glow, their expressions hardened and unyielding. There were 6 of them in total, their bodies tall and intimidating, their faces a mixture of grit and defiance. They stood as one, like a storm waiting to break, the air around them thick with tension. At the far end of the alley, an old man hobbled forward, his frail frame barely visible against the darkened backdrop. He was hunched over, his shoulders bowed as if carrying the weight of the world. His hands shook as he clutched his walking stick, the sound of his steps slow and labored. The bikers didn't move. They watched him closely, eyes narrowing as he approached, their presence a looming threat. There was no mercy in their stance, no understanding in their eyes. They were here for one reason and one reason only: to intimidate. The old man's steps faltered when he noticed the bikers blocking his path. He stopped, his heart thundering in his chest. He was used to the stares, the whispers, the judgments, but this was different. The tension in the air was suffocating. The bikers didn't just look at him, they loomed over him, sizing him up, waiting for him to make the next move. But there was no way out. No escape. A voice broke the silence. It was deep and gravelly, full of arrogance. Well, what do we have here? The biker at the front of the group, a man with a scarred face and a cruel grin, took a step forward. His eyes flickered over the old man's frail body, then locked onto his face. "You lost, old man?" The others laughed, the sound echoing in the alley like the growl of a predator. The old man looked up at them, his eyes tired but defiant. He had lived a long life, and fear no longer gripped him the way it used to. Still, the sheer presence of these bikers, their power, their violence, it was hard not to feel a pang of dread. "I'm not lost," he said, his voice shaky but firm. "I'm just passing through." The biker with the scar turned to his companions, smirking. "Passing through?" He repeated, as if the idea of an old man walking through their territory was absurd. He took a few slow steps forward, the sound of his boots echoing ominously. "I don't think you understand, old man. This is our territory. And nobody passes through here without a little help from us." He motioned to the other bikers, who closed in around the old man, circling him like vultures. They didn't touch him yet, but the threat was clear in their movements. The old man's grip on his cane tightened, his knuckles white against the wood. His chest tightened with each breath, but he stood tall, his eyes unwavering as he looked back at the bikers. "Go ahead," he said quietly. "Do what you must." The bikers laughed again, the sound cruel and mocking. They were used to breaking people down, to instilling fear in those weaker than them. But there was something about the old man's calm that unnerved them. He wasn't afraid. He didn't cower. He didn't beg for mercy. The biker with the scar walked around him, inspecting him like a prize. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he sneered. "But that doesn't mean you get to just walk through here without consequences." The old man's gaze flickered to the ground for a moment, then he looked up again, his eyes sharp despite his age. "I'm not afraid of you," he said simply. This time, the biker's laughter was a little less confident. They exchanged glances, sensing that something was off. The old man didn't look like much, but there was something in his voice that made them pause. Something that made them hesitate. But the scarred biker wasn't done yet. "Not afraid of us?" he scoffed, stepping even closer, so close now that the old man could feel his breath. "You should be, old man. You should be terrified. And when I'm done with you, you'll beg for mercy." The old man didn't flinch. He simply stared back, unwavering. "I have seen worse than you," he said, his voice low and steady. "You are nothing compared to what I've faced." A flicker of doubt passed over the scarred biker's face. He stopped in his tracks, his eyes narrowing as he looked the old man over. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice growing sharper. The old man let out a long breath, his fingers loosening around the cane. The silence in the alley grew thicker. He was no longer the frail, fragile old man they had expected. There was something behind his eyes, something that made even the toughest bikers pause. "I've faced more pain than you could ever imagine," he said quietly. "I've survived wars, tragedies, loss, and betrayal. What you see before you is just the shell of a man who has lived through it all. But I'm still standing." For a moment, the bikers didn't move. The air between them was thick with tension, the kind that comes when someone is no longer afraid to stand their ground. The scarred biker's bravado wavered as he looked at the old man, his mind racing with questions. Who was this man? Why wasn't he afraid? The old man took a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving the biker's face. "You think you intimidate me? You think you can scare me into submission? I've seen it all, boy. And I can't be broken anymore." There was a moment of stunned silence. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to do next. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. They were used to easy targets, people who trembled in fear at the mere sight of them. But the old man wasn't like the others. He wasn't backing down. The scarred biker took a step back, his lips parted in disbelief. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice now faltering. The old man stood tall, his presence filling the alley as the bikers, for the first time, felt a sliver of unease. "I'm a man who's survived things that would make your worst nightmares seem like child's play," he said, his voice steady and unyielding. "I've walked through fire and come out the other side. And I'm not afraid of you." The silence that followed was deafening. The bikers stood frozen, unable to respond, as the old man's words hung heavy in the air. They had expected to intimidate him, to break him. But what they had just heard had done something far worse. It had silenced them. For the first time, they were not in control. The scarred biker stood still, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his gaze fixed on the old man. The other bikers, who had been smirking and jeering moments ago, were now quiet, their eyes flickering nervously. They could feel the change in the air. The old man had somehow taken back the power in the alley, without raising a hand, without even threatening them directly. "Enough," the scarred biker muttered, trying to regain some of the bravado he had lost. He stepped forward again, his steps more cautious this time. "What are you trying to say, old man?" The old man didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his cane still in his hand, his grip no longer tight, but calm and deliberate. "What I'm saying is," he began, his voice low but clear, "is that there's more to life than just power and control. You don't intimidate people by strength alone. You intimidate them by their fear of losing everything they've worked for. But sometimes, all it takes is one person who isn't afraid anymore to change everything." The scarred biker's eyes flickered, his brow furrowing. "What the hell are you talking about?" he asked, clearly frustrated, trying to regain control over the situation. The old man leaned in slightly, his voice still steady, yet filled with something deeper, wisdom earned from a lifetime of hardship. "I've seen men like you, full of pride, full of anger. You think that being feared makes you strong. But strength isn't about fear. It's about resilience. It's about standing when everyone else would fall." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. "You want to know what's shocking? You're not even the ones I fear." The scarred biker took a step back now, the words catching him off guard. The other bikers exchanged uneasy glances, as if something in the air had changed. The old man was no longer the fragile figure they thought they could break with a few harsh words. He was something else entirely, something they hadn't expected. The old man smiled faintly, seeing the uncertainty in their eyes. "What you see in front of you is nothing. What I've been through, that's something. The battles I've fought, the people I've lost, you don't scare me because you don't know what true pain is. I've lived through wars, real ones. Not just the kind you've seen on the streets." The silence that followed was almost unbearable. The bikers remained still, no longer speaking, no longer laughing. Something about the old man's voice, the calm authority he exuded, was starting to affect them in a way they hadn't anticipated. For the first time, they were listening to him, not out of fear but out of respect. The biker closest to the old man, a young man with dark eyes and an expression of someone who had seen too much too soon, spoke up, his voice softer than before. "What are you saying? That we don't know what we're doing? That we don't understand life like you do?" The old man shook his head, a small sigh escaping his lips. "I'm not saying you don't understand life," he replied. But you're too young to have seen the kind of things that change a man. You think that controlling people, ruling them with fear, will make you strong. But all it does is isolate you. It makes you lose the only thing that keeps you alive in this world: connection. The bonds you form with others. You're looking for power in the wrong places. The bikers remained silent, each of them feeling the weight of his words. The once rowdy atmosphere had turned somber, the harsh light of the alley suddenly feeling distant and cold. The old man's revelation hung in the air, hanging over them like a heavy fog. The scarred biker finally spoke, his voice quieter, more reflective. "You think you've been through worse than us?" he asked, his words no longer laced with the same hostility. The old man nodded, his expression softening. "I know I have. But that's not the point. The point is we all face hardships. You, me, anyone. But it's how we respond to them that defines us. I could have let all the pain break me, but I chose not to. I chose to survive, to keep moving forward." For a moment, no one moved. The bikers were frozen in place, their once immense presence now overshadowed by the quiet strength of the old man. It was as if a wall had been erected between them, the usual bravado of the bikers crumbling under the weight of his words. One of the bikers, a young man with dark, curly hair and a glimmer of respect in his eyes, stepped forward, his tone more subdued. "So, what do you want from us? Do you want us to apologize? To leave you alone? What's your point, old man?" The old man studied him for a moment before answering. "I'm not asking for anything. I don't need your apology or your respect. But maybe, just maybe, you'll think twice before trying to intimidate someone again. Maybe you'll see that there's more to life than making people fear you. Maybe you'll see that the true strength lies in what you give, not what you take." Another long silence filled the alley, this time not uncomfortable but thoughtful. The bikers stood motionless, each of them processing the old man's words in their own way. For the first time, the old man had not been their prey, not their victim. He had turned the tables, and now, they were the ones who were lost for words. The scarred biker was the first to break the silence, his voice barely audible as he muttered under his breath. "You're not what I thought you were." The old man smiled faintly, his gaze unwavering. "None of us are." And with that, the bikers, one by one, began to disperse. There was no grand show of power, no final word spoken, just the sound of boots on concrete as they walked away from the old man. The silence remained, thick in the air, as the last biker turned and disappeared into the night. The old man stood there for a moment, looking after them. Then, slowly, he continued on his way, his cane tapping softly against the ground. As he walked into the darkness, he felt something shift within him, something he hadn't expected. It wasn't a victory over the bikers. It was a victory over fear itself. As the old man's footsteps faded into the distance, the alley was left in a strange stillness. The bikers, having retreated into the shadows, lingered for a few moments longer, as if waiting for the air to clear, for the tension to dissipate. But it didn't. There was something in the old man's words, in the unshakable way he had stood his ground, that left them feeling unsettled, unable to shake the feeling that they had just witnessed something far bigger than they could comprehend. The scarred biker, still standing where he had been, looked down at his boots. He kicked at the dirt, his usual arrogance stripped away, replaced by an unfamiliar sense of discomfort. The others, too, were silent, their faces unreadable, as if they had all heard the same echo of truth in the old man's voice. "Shit," the biker muttered, running a hand through his short hair. That old man, he was different. Another one of the bikers, a tall guy with tattoos running down his arms, shook his head. "I've never seen anyone stand up to us like that. Not like him. He wasn't afraid. You could see it in his eyes." The scarred biker let out a breath, frustration clear in his voice. "Yeah, well, it doesn't matter. He's gone now. No need to sit here feeling sorry for him." But the words sounded hollow, even to him. Something in the way the old man had spoken lingered, gnawing at him. "Maybe he's right, though," the young biker who had spoken earlier said quietly, his voice almost hesitant. "I mean, what if there's more to all this, more than just the tough guy routine? What if we're chasing the wrong thing?" The scarred biker shot him a hard look. "You're talking about him now?" He shook his head, anger flaring. Don't let his words get into your head. He's just some old man. He doesn't know anything about us. He doesn't know what it's like to fight for survival." The other bikers didn't respond immediately. The air had changed. The tough exterior they had worn for so long was now cracked. They had always relied on their intimidation, on their dominance, but today, something had shifted in the alley. It wasn't just about the old man's age or frailty. It was about his strength, his quiet resilience. The young biker spoke again, his voice softer now. "Maybe he does. Maybe he's been through things we can't even imagine." The scarred biker clenched his jaw but said nothing more. He turned and began walking toward his bike, signaling for the others to follow. One by one, they started up their motorcycles, the sound of engines roaring to life filling the alley. But this time, there was no laughter, no mocking comments. The silence was heavy with thought, with something they hadn't expected, doubt. As they rode out of the alley, the old man's words echoed in their minds. Each of them was left to process the encounter in their own way, to reflect on the idea of strength in a world they had once seen in black and white. They had always thought of power as something to be wielded, something that came from fear, from force. But what if the true power was something different, something more profound? As the bikers dispersed, heading in their own directions, the streets felt quieter than usual. No one had spoken, but each of them knew that something fundamental had changed. They were no longer just a group of young men looking to prove their dominance. There was a ripple now, a shift in their understanding of what it meant to be strong. The old man, meanwhile, continued on his way, his pace slow but steady, his thoughts far from the bikers. He had lived his life, seen the world change, seen it tear itself apart. He had lost everything, family, friends, countrymen, but he had never lost his will to keep going, to keep surviving. He had expected no different outcome from the bikers, though he had hoped, in his heart, that perhaps they would understand, that they might see something in themselves that they hadn't noticed before. He didn't expect them to change overnight. It wasn't his place to do that. But for the first time in a long time, he had spoken his truth. He had let them hear it, whether they were ready for it or not. The night air grew cooler as he walked, his footsteps echoing softly through the empty streets. He didn't know what would come next, what fate awaited him, but he had faced the darkness of life for so long that the unknown didn't scare him. It never had. In the distance, he could see the faint outline of the horizon, the promise of a new day, even if it was still far away. Back at the bikers' hangout, the quiet atmosphere hung heavy as the gang members returned, their bikes lined up against the dimly lit building. Their leader, the scarred biker, sat on his bike, staring out at the street, lost in thought. One of the other bikers approached him, hesitating before speaking. "You okay?" the younger man asked, his voice tentative. The scarred biker let out a long sigh, rubbing his jaw. "Yeah, just thinking." They sat in silence for a moment, the hum of engines fading into the distance. The tension from the alley was still present, like an invisible thread connecting them all. There was a shift in the group, a realization that they could no longer continue with the same mindset. The old man's words had opened something inside of them, something they hadn't even known was there. The leader looked up at the group, his voice low but steady. "We're not going to forget what happened back there. Not anytime soon." The younger biker nodded, looking around at the others, who were similarly subdued. The usual bravado had faded, replaced by a new kind of understanding. "We'll figure it out," the leader continued, his gaze hardening. "But we have to change. Not for him. For us." And with that, the bikers left the alley, each carrying with them the weight of the old man's words, words that would stay with them long after the night had passed. The old man's words would echo through their minds for days, and in time, it would change more than just their view of him. It would change the way they saw themselves, the way they saw the world. The next few days were a slow burn for the bikers. Each of them went their separate ways, the encounter in the alley continuing to haunt them. What was once an ordinary day had turned into something else entirely, something none of them had expected. They couldn't shake the feeling that they were at a crossroads, but none of them knew where that road would lead. The biker gang had always been about power, dominance on the streets, respect from everyone else, and the constant, intoxicating rush of fear. But after meeting the old man, the cracks in their world began to show. The scarred biker, now the leader of the gang, spent the next few nights alone, sitting in the dim-lit corner of his apartment, drinking in silence. He had always prided himself on his ability to intimidate, to make people cower at the sound of his name. He had thrived in that fear, both the fear he instilled in others and the fear he kept locked inside himself. But now, every time he closed his eyes, the old man's steady, unshakable gaze filled his thoughts. The words had settled deep into his mind, like a splinter that refused to be removed. Strength isn't about fear, the old man had said. It's about resilience. He couldn't understand how someone so fragile could be so strong. The scars on his face were a constant reminder of the battles he had fought, of the reputation he had built, but now, for the first time in years, he found himself questioning everything he thought he knew. He didn't have answers yet, but one thing was certain. The path he had been on felt like it was leading him somewhere he didn't want to go. The other bikers felt the same shift. The once carefree nature of their gang meetings became subdued, a heavy quiet hanging over their usual banter. The tension was thick, but it wasn't just between the bikers themselves. It was a tension that came from within each of them. The younger ones, in particular, seemed uneasy, no longer looking at the streets as a place to prove themselves. They didn't know how to explain it, but something inside them had changed. Something had cracked, and they were left with the uncertainty of what was real and what was just a mask they'd worn their whole lives. One afternoon, the young man who had first spoken up after the old man's encounter approached the leader. He stood at the edge of the hangout, hesitant, watching his leader, who was sitting on his bike, staring off into the distance. "Hey," the young man began, his voice cautious. "You okay?" The scarred biker turned to look at him, his expression unreadable. "I don't know," he replied, his voice rough. "But I've been thinking about what that guy said." The young biker took a step forward, hands stuffed into the pockets of his leather jacket. "I can't stop thinking about it." He was old, weak. He could barely stand, and yet he didn't flinch. He didn't back down. It's like he saw through all of us. The scarred biker grunted, his fingers tightening around the handlebars of his bike. "What's worse is that I think we were the ones who were afraid." The young man looked down, his eyes shifting as if processing the weight of the words. "Fear. Yeah, I think you're right." He paused before adding, "I don't know if I'm scared of him, or scared of what he might have been right about." They stood in silence for a long moment, the noise of the hangout quieting around them as the others continued with their own conversations, unaware of the shift taking place in their midst. Finally, the scarred biker broke the silence. "Maybe it's time for a change," he said slowly. "Maybe we need to find something else to live for, something bigger than just this." The young biker's eyes widened slightly. "You mean, what, like stop everything? Change the whole game?" The scarred biker didn't answer immediately. Instead, he kicked his bike into gear, the low rumble of the engine breaking the silence. "Maybe not stop everything, but maybe we can think about what happens next. I don't know about you, but I don't want to end up like those guys who are just chasing the next fight, the next thrill. We're better than that." Later that evening, the group gathered, the bikes lined up in the same alley where they had first encountered the old man. This time, the air was different. The usual bravado, the loud jokes, and the posturing were gone. The gang stood together, but they were no longer united by fear or dominance. Now, they were uncertain, caught between the life they had known and the life that seemed to be slowly calling them forward. One by one, the bikers spoke up. It started slowly, but it built into something stronger as each man, each woman, began to open up. "I think we've been doing this all wrong," one of the bikers said, his voice softer than usual. "We've been chasing after something that doesn't matter. I don't know if I'm ready to give it all up, but I want something different. I want to know that when I look back on my life, I didn't just waste it." Another biker, a woman with dark hair and a tough exterior, nodded in agreement. "Yeah, the whole being feared thing. It doesn't sit right anymore. I think it's time we make our own rules." The scarred biker, now more reflective than ever, looked at them all, taking in their words. He'd been the one to lead them for so long, but now, in the face of their uncertainty, he realized that leadership wasn't just about power. It was about guiding them to something more meaningful, something more sustainable. "Maybe we've been wrong," he said, his voice steady now. But it's not too late to make it right. As the meeting drew to a close, the bikers began to scatter, each with their own thoughts, each processing the changes they were about to face. There were no cheers, no promises of victory or glory. Just a quiet understanding that things were different now. The old man had shown them something they hadn't seen before, that real strength came from resilience, from connection, and from not backing down when it counted the most. And as the last of the bikers revved their engines and rode off into the night, the scarred biker lingered for a moment longer, staring at the empty alley. He could hear the echo of the old man's words in his mind. Strength isn't about fear. It's about resilience. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt something he hadn't expected: hope. And that, he realized, was the beginning of something new. The following weeks were a period of quiet reflection for the bikers. What had started as a chance encounter with an old man had sparked a change none of them had been prepared for. The gang was still together, still riding hard through the streets, but now, the edge that had once defined them, the hunger for fear and dominance, was beginning to soften. Their once brutal tactics had shifted, not because they had forgotten how to fight, but because they had begun to question what they were fighting for. They still carried the same bikes, still wore the same leather jackets, but there was now an unspoken understanding between them all. They weren't just a group of bikers, they were a group of people trying to find their own way, trying to build something meaningful. The scarred biker, now reflecting on his new role, found himself leading the group down a different path. He had spent years commanding respect through intimidation, but he realized now that the most powerful thing he could do was give his crew something more than fear: respect. The kind of respect that came from mutual understanding, from standing together, not just as a group of tough riders but as individuals who had earned the right to be themselves. One evening, as the sun began to set, he called another meeting, though this one felt different. The group gathered outside an old diner, its neon sign flickering in the fading light. They leaned against their bikes, looking up at their leader, waiting for him to speak. "I've been thinking a lot about what we're doing here," the scarred biker began, his voice calm but filled with an undeniable weight. "The world out there is changing, and we can either keep chasing the same old game or we can choose to be something more than just bikers who cause chaos for the sake of it." The others exchanged glances, the tension between them settling into curiosity rather than uncertainty. For the first time, they were looking at their leader not as a figure to follow blindly, but as a man with real thoughts and convictions. "The truth is," he continued, "we've been running from something. Running from our pasts, running from what we think we have to be to survive. But I'm starting to think we can be something more. We don't have to live in fear. We don't have to hurt others to make our lives count. We've seen what happens when you start looking beyond the power games. And it's time we stop pretending that it's all about being the toughest on the block." The group was quiet for a long moment, processing his words. No one spoke. No one needed to. The weight of what was being said was enough. "We can still ride," he added with a slight smile. "We can still be who we are. But we can do it with purpose. We can use our strength to protect, to help, not to tear down. And that starts with us, each of us looking at who we are and what we want to become. I'm done with just running the streets for the sake of it. I want something real." That night, as they rode through the city, the bikers' minds were elsewhere. The sound of their engines still rumbled through the streets, but it was different now. They weren't just seeking out trouble or domination. They were seeking meaning in a world that had always told them that strength came from fear and control. They had seen it now, the truth in the old man's eyes, the quiet strength he had carried with him. And somehow, it had awakened something in all of them. The gang had once been a place to hide from their own weaknesses, a place to mask their fears and insecurities under layers of leather and steel. But now, there was a chance to rebuild something better. The following weeks saw the bikers making small changes. They began volunteering at local shelters, offering help where they could, doing the things that no one would expect of a gang like theirs. At first, it was awkward. They didn't know how to approach helping others, how to speak to people without the usual bravado. But gradually, they learned. They saw how their actions, not their reputation, could make a difference. One afternoon, the leader and a few of the others stopped by a community center, offering to fix up the bikes of some of the neighborhood kids who had taken an interest in riding. It wasn't much, but it felt like a step forward. The young man who had spoken up first after their encounter with the old man was particularly changed. He had begun to connect with the younger members of the gang in a way that he hadn't before. He took on the role of mentoring them, teaching them not just about bikes, but about life, how to ride with integrity, how to face challenges head-on without resorting to violence. One day, after a long ride, the young biker found himself sitting on a curb, looking out over the city. The evening sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. He let out a long breath, feeling the weight of the past few weeks settle into something lighter. "I'm not the person I thought I was," he murmured to himself. "I think I've been afraid of something all along. Afraid of being more than just the guy on the bike. Afraid of actually being something that matters." Back at their hangout, the group gathered again, this time for a different kind of meeting. They didn't have a purpose to their gathering other than to be together, to reaffirm the bond that had begun to form between them. There was no talk of power or control. No talk of proving who was strongest or toughest. Instead, they shared stories. Stories of the past. Of what they wanted for the future. The scarred biker, still the leader, stood up and addressed them all. "This isn't just about riding anymore," he said quietly, his voice strong. "This is about us. And I don't know where we're going, but I do know that I'm proud of the men and women sitting here tonight. We've been through hell, and we're still standing. We're still riding. But now, we ride for something else. We ride because we know who we are." And with that, they all raised their glasses to the new path they were forging, the new identity they had chosen to embrace. The road ahead wasn't easy. It was filled with challenges and moments of doubt. But the old man's words had given them something they hadn't realized they'd been missing, a sense of purpose beyond the surface. They were still bikers, still strong and proud, but now they carried something with them that couldn't be taken away. The knowledge that real strength was found not in fear, but in resilience, in facing life head-on with compassion and the willingness to grow. As they rode into the horizon, the sound of their engines reverberating through the quiet night, they didn't just ride for power. They rode for the future they could shape, for the lives they could touch, and for the bond they had found in one another. They rode for redemption. The next few months were a journey of growth for the bikers. What had started as a subtle shift in their perspective grew into a full-blown transformation. They found themselves drawn to new challenges, new experiences that tested their resilience in ways they hadn't anticipated. They no longer sought out the thrill of fear, the adrenaline rush of dominance over others. Instead, they focused on building trust with those around them, proving that they were capable of more than what people expected of them. The scarred biker, now more thoughtful than ever, took the reins in a new direction. He had once been a man who led through intimidation, but now he led with purpose. He began organizing community rides, helping local organizations, and even sponsoring motorcycle workshops for young people who were looking for an outlet. It was a far cry from the reckless chaos they had been a part of before, but it felt right. It felt like something they could stand behind. One evening, after a particularly successful community event where they had worked with underprivileged kids to teach them basic motorcycle repair, the bikers sat together around a fire. The crackling of the flames was the only sound in the air, as the stars above glistened like a silent witness to their growth. The leader of the gang leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he stared into the fire. "I never thought I'd be here, you know," he said quietly, breaking the silence. "Never thought we'd be doing this kind of thing. Helping out instead of tearing things down." One of the bikers, a tall man with a rough face and ink-covered arms, nodded slowly. "It's been strange for sure. But it feels good. We're actually doing something now. Something that matters." Another member, a younger guy with a nervous energy about him, looked around at the group. "You think people are starting to see us differently?" The scarred biker chuckled softly. "I don't know if we're ever going to fully shed the past. But at least we can give them something else to think about. Something they didn't expect." For a moment, everyone fell silent, reflecting on the journey they'd been on. The path they had chosen wasn't easy, and it wasn't without its challenges. But they had found strength in each other, in the bonds they had forged through their shared experiences. They had once been a group of individuals trying to prove something to the world. Now they were a family, united in a purpose greater than themselves. A few weeks later, the group was on another ride, this time taking a route through the quiet countryside. The roads were winding and narrow, the hills rising and falling as the sun began to dip below the horizon. They had just completed a successful fundraiser for a local youth center, and the air was filled with a quiet sense of pride. They weren't done yet, not by a long shot. There were still battles to fight, both within themselves and within their communities. But for the first time in a long time, they weren't fighting just to survive. They were fighting to thrive. As the group pulled over to the side of the road to rest, the leader of the gang got off his bike and stretched. He looked over at his crew, his eyes filled with a quiet determination. "We've come a long way," he said, his voice carrying over the gentle hum of the engines. "We've been through a lot. And we've made a lot of mistakes. But we're not done. We can still make a difference. And that's what we're going to keep doing." The younger man who had spoken up at the fire earlier smiled, his face illuminated by the fading light. "Yeah, we're a lot different than we were before. But that's a good thing, right?" The leader nodded. "I think so." For the first time in months, the bikers weren't just looking at the road ahead with the usual bravado or the need to prove something to the world. They were looking at it with a sense of purpose. They didn't need to be the toughest or the most feared. They didn't need to carve their names into the streets with violence. What mattered now was the legacy they were building, one that would be remembered not for their dominance, but for the positive change they had brought to the lives of others. A few weeks later, the bikers gathered once again, this time at a local charity event. They had been invited to share their story with the community they had worked so hard to help, and they were eager to show the people around them that they were not the same group they had once been. As they stood on stage, the crowd cheered them on, and the leader of the gang stepped up to speak. His voice was steady, his words clear. "We used to be a gang," he began, his eyes sweeping over the crowd. "We used to think the world worked by fear and power. But that's not what we're about anymore. We've learned that strength isn't about how many people you can make fear you. Strength is about how many people you can help. Strength is about the people you lift up, not push down." The crowd erupted into applause, and the bikers stood together, their heads held high, proud of the journey they had taken. No longer a symbol of intimidation, they were now seen as a force for good in their community. They had taken the first steps toward redemption, and while the road ahead was long, they were no longer walking it alone. As the evening came to a close, the bikers stood outside the venue, the night air crisp and clear. They had made it through the hardest part, the part where they had to let go of their old identities and embrace a new path. The leader of the gang looked around at his crew, his heart swelling with pride. "We've got a long way to go," he said softly, "but we're on the right track. Let's keep pushing forward. Let's keep showing the world who we are now." The crew nodded, their faces filled with determination. They were no longer the merciless bikers who had once ruled the streets. They were something more. A family, a group of people who had chosen to be better. And as they revved their engines and set off into the night, the road stretched out before them, not as a path to power, but as a path to redemption. For the first time in their lives, they weren't just riding to survive. They were riding for something bigger than themselves. They were riding to make a difference. The months following the community event were filled with growth, but growth is never without its trials. The bikers had begun to find new purpose in their lives, but the shadows of their past still loomed large. Old habits were hard to shake, and not everyone in their community was as eager to accept their transformation. The streets they once ruled with fear and pride were still filled with those who remembered who they had been, and not all of them were ready to let go of the old narrative. One afternoon, as the gang gathered in their usual hangout spot, a garage that had once been the epicenter of their rebellious activities, the atmosphere was noticeably tense. The old buzz of laughter and shouting was gone, replaced by uneasy silence. The leader of the bikers sat at the front, his face etched with concern. His mind was racing, filled with the weight of the choices they had made. "We knew it wouldn't be easy," he said, breaking the silence. "But things are starting to heat up again. Not everyone is happy with the changes we've made. People still see us as the same gang, and some of them are reminding us of that every chance they get." The younger members of the gang shifted uncomfortably, their expressions tense. It was clear they had been expecting this. The streets might have been changing, but the world was slow to evolve. Fear and violence were easy, familiar tools to fall back on, and not everyone wanted the bikers to leave that life behind. "They want us to stay the way we were," one of the younger bikers, a man in his 20s with a scruffy beard, muttered. "They think we can't change. They think we're still the same monsters they remember." The scarred leader stood up, rubbing his chin, deep in thought. "We can't control how others see us," he said. "But we've got to keep proving we're not who we used to be. We can't let them drag us back into that life. If we do, we're no better than we were before." There was a long pause as the bikers considered his words. Their leader's voice was firm, but it wasn't enough to shake the uneasy feelings settling in their stomachs. The world was testing them now. It was easy to change when things were quiet, when the streets were calm. But this was different. This was the moment when everything they had worked for was at stake. A few days later, the bikers were faced with a direct challenge. Word had spread that a rival gang, one they had clashed with in the past, was making moves into their territory. It was a group known for its ruthlessness, a gang that thrived on intimidation and fear. The old, familiar instinct to fight back, to show their dominance, flared up in the bikers. They had gathered again, their bikes lined up in the parking lot of a small diner, ready for a confrontation they hadn't wanted, but felt was inevitable. "This is it," the scarred biker said as he checked the fuel tank of his bike, his mind clearly elsewhere. "We can't let them think they can just walk all over us. But we also can't let it become a war like it used to be." One of the younger bikers, a quiet man with short hair and sharp eyes, turned to him. "Are we going to fight or not? They're coming, and if we don't stand up for ourselves now, we'll lose everything we've worked for." The scarred biker's face was unreadable, his eyes flickering with doubt. "I don't know if I can keep leading like this, thinking violence is the answer. We're not that gang anymore." He paused, glancing around at the men and women who had once been willing to fight anyone who threatened their turf. They were still tough, still ready to take on any challenge. But now, they were different. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if fighting was the right choice. Later that evening, the rival gang made their move. They rolled into the diner parking lot, their bikes loud and imposing, just as they always had been. But this time, the air was different. The bikers stood their ground, their postures tense, but their eyes focused. The leader of the rival gang stepped off his bike, a grin spreading across his face as he sized up the group. "I heard you guys had gone soft," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Guess I was wrong. But I'm still not impressed. You gonna let us take over, or do you want to fight for it?" The scarred biker stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. He wasn't afraid, but the weight of his decision was clear. "We don't want to fight you," he said, his voice steady but firm. "But we're not going to let you just take what's ours." The rival gang leader laughed, a cruel sound that echoed in the night. "You've gone soft, haven't you? You really think you can just talk your way out of this?" For a moment, it seemed like the tension would snap, like the old instincts would take over. The air was thick with hostility, the sound of engines rumbling louder as both gangs stood their ground. But then, something unexpected happened. One of the younger bikers, the one who had first questioned their old ways, stepped forward. He wasn't scared, but he wasn't angry either. "We don't have to prove anything to you," he said, his voice clear and calm. "We're not here to fight. We're here to protect what's ours. But we won't do it by tearing you down." The words were simple, but they struck a chord. The rival gang leader hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. He was used to intimidation, to the fear that followed their reputation, but the calm certainty in the younger biker's voice stopped him in his tracks. The scarred leader of the bikers stood silently, watching the moment unfold. He had expected an all-out brawl, but instead, he was seeing something different, something powerful. They weren't fighting out of anger or fear. They were standing up for what they believed in, for what they had worked to build. The rival gang leader took a step back, his grin fading as he realized that the bikers weren't the same as they had been before. "We'll see about this," he muttered, before signaling his crew to get back on their bikes. "But don't think you've won yet." As the rival gang rode off into the distance, the bikers stood in the parking lot, a quiet sense of relief washing over them. They had faced the test, perhaps the greatest test of all. and had passed it without resorting to violence. It wasn't a victory in the traditional sense, but it felt like one. The scarred biker looked at his crew, his expression softening for the first time in a long while. We didn't fight. And we didn't back down. That's a win. They all knew that the battle for their new identity was far from over. There would be other challenges, other moments when their resolve would be tested. But in that moment, under the dim lights of the diner, surrounded by their bikes, they knew one thing for certain. They had changed. They were no longer a gang of merciless bikers. They were a family, united not by the fear they once instilled in others, but by the strength they found in each other.